Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Welcome. I'm Derrick Pratt, Director of Education here at the Erie Canal Museum. Thank you all for being here on this lovely, still summer evening, I guess, to hear me talk about baseball. Thank you as well to the Winifred and DeVillo Sloan Family Fund for helping to make all of our talks this year possible. We greatly appreciate it. Before I get started into the talk, I have a few quick commercials. Our next lunchtime lecture, which are held on Thursdays at noon, will be September 26th. I will again be speaking, but it's not just going to be me. We are doing a talk on several of the lateral canals off of the Erie. So I'll be talking about the Genesee Valley Canal. Diane Van Slyke from the Shenango Canal Association will be talking about the Shenango Canal, and Gary Emerson will discuss the Chemung Canal, which was at the bottom of Seneca Lake. So that should be a really fun kind of roundtable discussion on those often unknown canals. Then our next deeper dive will be October 5th at 1 p.m. One of our artists in residence, Alon Kopel, will be talking about his process of taking historic photographs and then recreating them kind of in the modern time. So he photographs the same place and then shows them side by side. It's a pretty neat thing that he does. We also have our Beers, Bikes, and Barges series. We still have 2 rides left. Next Thursday night in Amsterdam, we will be doing one of our guided rides. And then on the 19th, we finish the season in my hometown of Chittenango. We're partnering with Chittenango Landing on that one. So if you ride a bike, come on down. But anyway, on to today's talk. I don't have to introduce anyone today, really. So it's me. Like I said, I'm Director of Education here. So let's just dive into it. Tonight, we're going to be talking primarily about pro baseball along the Erie Canal, kind of the major leagues, if you will, of baseball along the banks of the canal. Because as the name of this talk indicates, for kind of half of a century, upstate New York, the canal corridor was in a lot of ways the center of the professional baseball universe. But let's go back a bit in time before that. Baseball has been played on the banks of the canal, or at least an early form of it, for as long as there has been a canal. We have early accounts, including those by Thurlow Weed, who would eventually become a very major politician from Rochester. He has an account in 1825 of baseball being played at Mumford's Meadow, which is right between the canal and the falls of the Genesee. So you've got that going on. We have other accounts of here in Syracuse, ball being played on both sides of the canal out in Clinton Square. In fact, by 1842, playing ball had become so popular in Syracuse that the city had to start making laws about how and where you could play baseball. On July 4th, 1842, Syracuse may have passed its most un-American law banning baseball in Clinton and Hanover squares specifically. Apparently balls were probably breaking shop windows and stuff, I would imagine. Though, of course, this is not the baseball that we know. This is even before the New York Knickerbockers would, quote unquote, kind of invent the modern game of baseball. They instead were playing a different type of game called town ball. And as the name town ball kind of indicates, every town had its own rules, oftentimes, especially around how you play things like outs, how many people were allowed on the field, how you scored runs, how many runs won a game, or if it was based on innings, etc. There's a million different rules for town ball. Oops, I haven't advanced my slide yet. There we go. So here we see one of these early canal towns. This is the town of Fulton on the Oswego Canal, which the Canal Society of New York, whose collections until very recently were housed here, they had us scanning this just to make a post about Fulton. But it was noticed right here in the foreground, you can actually see folks playing ball. So you can see how pervasive this game of ball was. That even by this point, ball is being played along the canal. And as the sport grew in popularity, people started wanting to play one another. And this whole idea of having different towns, having different rules, became more and more kind of tedious and hard to manage. So let's skip ahead. 20 years after the canal is open, New York City has become America's premier port because all the trade of the Midwest is being funneled right through the city. It's growing. There are a lot of ball clubs. And eventually, the New York Knickerbockers will write down a series of rules. They will actually play their first game of baseball in New Jersey and Hoboken in the Elysian Fields, as they're called. And these rules are kind of the basis of what we know today as the modern sport of baseball. Most of its modern rules are laid down at this time, though it will continue to evolve over the years. And we'll see some of this evolution over the course of this talk. And this is still also, this is just one set of rules. The Knickerbocker rules kind of get adopted by New York City. It becomes kind of New York's town ball rules, almost, you could imagine it. There are other competing versions of baseball that exist at this time. Notably, there is the Boston game. This becomes known as the New York game. And then you also have another version that takes hold kind of in the Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. sort of region. And they're sort of competing. But the Canal Corridor, because of its close connections with New York City, this is the type of game that's going to be really played up here for the most part. Our next big kind of innovation is January 3rd, 1857, the National Association of Baseball Players is founded. There are so many people playing this New York game that a league is sort of created. This is much more loose than the leagues we have today, but the NABBP is kind of, you can consider that the first league. They include a number of different teams are part of this organization of baseball players along the canal. Notably, there are the Niagaras of Buffalo and the Hiawathas of Utica. There's also a Rochester team that goes by a number of different names. You've got the Flower City, the Live Oak, the Charter Oaks, the Olympic, and the Lone Stars of Rochester all exist at this time. The Charter Oaks even include one Charles Douglas, the son of Frederick Douglass, is on that team. So they have this first league. Almost immediately, people start realizing, like, hey, once we have organized baseball, we can start making money off of this. 1858, you have your first paid game between the All-Stars of Manhattan and the All-Stars of Brooklyn, which at the time are two separate cities. They're not going to be merged until the late 1890s, in fact. But once money enters the game, the NABBP was founded on amateurism. No one was getting paid at that point. But then once people start making money as baseball team owners or field owners, so the players start saying, maybe I should get some money as well. That's where we get our first character we're going to look at. This man, Jim Creighton, who in 1860 is often considered one of the first, if not the first, professional player. He is not directly paid by his team, the Brooklyn Atlantics. Instead, a lot of these baseball teams are sponsored by different organizations. So businesses, fire departments are really big. Fire department's kind of sponsored Creighton's team. He kind of gets a like do nothing job with the fire department and is sort of more brought on as a ringer for their baseball team. And Creighton's big draw is this is an era where you pitched underhand from 45 feet away. Back then, the batter would also tell the pitcher where he wanted the ball, high or low. Creighton had figured out a way, however, to throw that ball underhand really fast. He is generally credited with being the inventor of the fastball. So this is still an era of baseball when you can invent that. Other ways people like Creighton would be paid, you would have what were called charity games, but nowadays you might play a charity game for the Erie Canal Museum or something. All the proceeds go to that. Instead, the charities were your star players. They got the money. So there's one well-known instance of Creighton's team. It was a benefit game between him and Dickie Pierce, who's generally credited with inventing the shortstop position as well. So Creighton became an early star as a pitcher. However, his star would be short-lived, as during a game, there seem to be conflicting accounts about what happened. Whether he hit a home run so hard, whether his strange motion for throwing the fastball or some other incident on the field occurred. Either way, he ended up tearing something inside of him during the game and would pass away a few days later, very young age. That's our first death of the presentation. It won't be our last. Anyway, weird transition, but something that occurred right after Jim Creighton died will really spread the game even further, and that is the Civil War. New York will, of course, not of course, but it does contribute the most soldiers to the war effort of any state. So these soldiers are moving all around the country, often interacting with soldiers from other states and other regions. Some of them are captured. And all of them, whenever they have downtime, are oftentimes playing baseball. And they introduce the New York game farther and farther across the country. We have accounts of baseball being played in prisoner of war camps in the South, in Army bases. There's even in Texas, a game is interrupted one time when the outfielder is shot. That is when they realize the Confederates have arrived. This spreads this game, it makes it much more popular. And even during the war and afterwards, the NABBP expands rapidly. A lot more teams will join. Like that Hiawatha's of Utica club I mentioned, they joined in 1866, the NABBP. So by the late 60s, the NABBP is getting a lot more unruly. There are a ton of teams, many of them along the canal, but it's getting harder to control these teams. And there's also becoming more and more spread out talent. So some are, your Brooklyn Atlantics that can afford to pay some of their players, if not even most of them. And then there are others, I'm going to guess the Utica Hiawathas, they're having a hard time competing against the much larger Brooklyn Atlantics and New York Mutuals and what have you. So there's really good teams, and they draw tons of people out to their games. Now we look at our first team. And by 1868, that's fully in force. There's a lot of really good teams, especially in big cities. One such great team is the Cincinnati Red Sox. In 1868, they're one of the best teams in the NABBP. They're paying several of their players, but they lose what essentially is kind of a championship game to the Washington Nationals. Not today's Nationals, I should mention. But they're going to lose to the Nationals. And they're sick and tired of losing. They want to create a winning team. So it's decided that for the 1869 season, the Red Stockings they're not going to try to dance around these rules about amateurism in the NABBP. They're going to pay all of their players, and they're upfront about it. They're going to have a good enough team that it doesn't matter if they're part of this league. People are going to come watch them, and people will want to play them. And that's what they do. They start out the 69 season, all paid lineup. And they start in Cincinnati. They win every game. And then it comes to June of 1869, and they have their first kind of road series. This is a different era than our time of Jets, where you play like 3 games in Milwaukee, then you're down in Miami for the next 3. Instead, you're going on a circuit all around the East Coast. So June of 69, the Red Stockings head east, and they will play a number of the first teams that are going to play on this East Coast trip are along the Erie Canal. They will stop in Buffalo, Rochester, Troy, and Albany. And they're going to beat up on some of these teams. I believe it is the Buffalo and Albany games. They win. They score 40 runs, 40 plus runs. The other team scores single digits. Rochester gives them more of a run for their money. I think it's like 19-12 is the final score. And Troy is actually a very close game. So much so that Troy, Cincinnati is starting to become a bit of a rivalry. And then, so long story short, the Red Stockings win all their games on this road trip, head on back to Cincinnati. And a lot of these teams they played earlier in the year head on back to Cincinnati to play against the Red Stockings. And that's where we get our first kind of interesting moment from a Canal team. On August 26th, the Troy Haymakers, as they were called, give the Red Stockings the only blemish on their undefeated season. But let's talk a little bit more about that. The Troy Haymakers, as the name kind of implies, are a bit of a rough and tumble team. They like to fight. They may have had some connections with gamblers, which is possibly why they tied as well. This was huge. Again, the Trojans had given the Red Stockings one of their hardest fights at that point in time in the season. So the people of Troy were all gathered around the telegraph station from the newspaper accounts we have, eagerly waiting to hear the results of this game, the play-by-play. But then suddenly play stopped. That's because allegedly, some have alleged at least, that the Trojans may have had some money on this game. The game was tied up, and there was a somewhat controversial play at the plate. Controversial enough that the manager of the Troy Haymakers was able to go out and essentially filibuster until the sun set. And there being no electric lights in stadiums yet, the game would be declared a tie. Eventually, Major League Baseball, or whoever the governing body was at the time, did force the Haymakers to forfeit the game. But nonetheless, this team, which is now enshrined in Cooperstown, the only blemish on their record comes from the Canal Corridor. And indeed, they would win every game in 1869, and they'd keep winning until they played June 14th, 1870, against the Brooklyn Atlantics. And this game, while they remained tied 9 innings, they made the fateful decision to play extra innings. It's often considered the first extra innings game in Major League Baseball, and the Red Stockings lost to Brooklyn. As Meadowlark Lemon would famously say, no one likes a loser, and indeed, no one did. The Red Stockings hemorrhaged fan support afterwards in Cincinnati. People stopped showing up to their games since other teams had adopted, this paid player model, and eventually they would have to move out to Boston, keeping the Red Stockings name with them. And they still exist today. Anyone know who they are? No, they are not. They are the Atlanta Braves. Yes, but the Red Sox in the American League, which we'll talk about later, will take their name from them. And you also mentioned them too, Dave. The Cincinnati Reds are also named after the Cincinnati Red Stockings as well. So, and that's why Cincinnati, before we started playing games in like Japan and South Korea and Australia and what have you, Cincinnati traditionally has been where the first game of the season is typically played as well. So the Red Stockings have a huge influence on the game, and they'll come back later as well. So after the Red Stockings flout these rules, pretty much there's no way the NABVP can keep pretending like it has control on their teams, and they fold pretty soon after that. 1871, a new league is created, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, or the NA. You don't have to worry too much about that, though they do include the descendants of the Haymakers, the Troy Unions. However, the NA has a lot of problems as well financially. They will fold in 1875, and that winter, baseball team owners will again meet, led largely by A.G. Spalding, a former pitcher for the Red Stockings, now owner of the Chicago club, and you probably know more well his famous sports brand, Spalding. They formed in 1876, found the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs. This still exists today. It is our National League. However, at the time, people did not realize that the NL was going to be the NL. It was just one of many competing leagues throughout America at the time. Granted, this one had a lot more money behind it and some of the better players, but other leagues are forming at the same time, including an important one to our story, founded in 1877, the International Association, which includes numerous teams throughout upstate New York. I saw someone in the crowd was a Red Wings fan as well. 1877 is also when the Rochester Baseball Club was established as well. It will eventually become the Red Wings. Anyway, so the International Association is important. A lot of the teams we're going to be talking about play much of the time in the IA, and that still exists today as well as the International League, which the Syracuse Mets, Buffalo Bison, and Rochester Red Wings still compete in. So these are all, almost 150-year-old institutions at this point. The National League still has its issues. Some of its teams have real bad financial problems, drop in and out of the league. There's turmoil in the NL. And 82 is when you have your first year where no new teams enter the National League and none have dropped out from the previous year. You have the establishment of a general circuit. And it works well for this talk because it's where it gets its title from. And we'll see how important kind of canals are to the development of many of the towns that are big enough to support professional clubs. This is a map from 1850 or so showing the major inland waterways of the country. And I'll show you where the 8 teams in the National League were located. You've got the Chicago White Stockings, the Detroit Wolverines, the Grove City something or others. Grove City is another name for Cleveland, the Buffalo Bison, the Troy Trojans, the Worcester Redlegs, the Boston Red Stockings, and the Providence Grays. So you see right here in the center, as they're mostly taking trains, to be honest. The Erie Canal is kind of central geographically to this National League. And as we will see, many of its biggest stars will come from the canal and play in several of its biggest cities. All right, so let's look at some of those teams. We'll start out on the east with the Troy Trojans, who we've already kind of met. They are descended from the Haymakers and those Troy Unions in the NA. They are asked to join the National League in 1879. And their roster, if you look at it, seems like it's a pretty stacked roster. They have 5 future Hall of Famers who will play for the Troy Trojans. Dan Brothers, who we're going to talk a bit more about later. Mickey Welch, the first lefty to win 300 games. Roger Connor, whose career home run record Babe Ruth would eventually break. Tim Keefe, he's another 300-game winner. Interestingly, his first season with the Trojans, he throws underhand and from 45 feet away. That's the last season where that happens. His final season will be he'll be throwing overhand. The first season that the modern mound distance of 60 feet, 6 inches is established as well. So he'll have a long career and a pretty great career as well. And then they also have Buck Ewing, generally considered the greatest catcher of this era, the first catcher ever enshrined in the Hall of Fame. With a roster like that, you'd think that the Troy Trojans were going to be great, right? Well, you'd be wrong. The Troy Trojans are horrible. They are pretty much always in 7th or 8th place while they are in the National League. All of those Hall of Famers that I have listed up there, they're young kids at the time. They are still developing ball players, and the Trojans, sadly, will fold in 1882. Go with that. Yeah. At the end of that season, so they play in Watervliet or West Troy, right next to the canal, essentially, and it's Waylock. They're so bad that one game in September, 6 fans show up. They decided to not play the rest of the season after that. Not great for the Trojans. But let's look at one of the Hall of Famers that played for them, because he is in many ways connected to the Canal Corridor and upstate New York. Big Dan Brothers. Brothers was born in 1858 in Sylvan Lake, New York. That's out near the Albany area. And he started playing baseball, like so many others in this region, at a young age. And he ended up playing for minor league ball with his local Wappingers Falls Actives. This is where he came to the attention of Major League scouts when, in a play at the plate, he ran over the catcher and killed him. That's one way to get the scouts' attention. The local Troy Trojans noticed this guy killing people on the baseball field. He was cleared of any wrongdoing, to be clear. It was just kind of a freak accident. And the Trojans would sign him in 1879, the first year in the National League. And he played with them for 2 years. However, the Trojans used Brothers, even though his natural position was first base. They instead often used him as a pitcher. And Dan Brothers is not currently in the Hall of Fame for his ERA, which is terrible. The Trojans cut Dan Brothers pretty soon after. He actually ended up heading west down the canal, finding a job as a first baseman this time in the 1880, 1881 seasons with the Rochester Baseball Club. And there he even hit a game-winning home run against the Buffalo Bison from, as we're going to see, the National League. He hits a home run against them and their future Hall of Fame pitcher, Pud Galvin. And the next year, the Bison would sign Brothers and start playing him at first base, where he'd become one of the biggest stars. By the time that he retired, he would be top 5 in almost every major statistical batting category. He still is top 10 in a few different categories as well. Playing first for the Bison, which we'll look a bit more at in a second, as well as 7 other teams. He would also help to form the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players, which is your first baseball union as well, when he was out in Detroit. And he loved baseball. He stayed in the area for much of his life, playing in his local Hudson River League until he was 46 years old. And when he retired at the age of 46, he had led the Hudson River League in batting average that year. And we'll see he comes back in our story later as well. So yeah, here's this guy who much of his early career is spent right here in the Canal corridor, and he grew up in an area heavily influenced by the Canal as well. So let's look at the other team that he played for, the Buffalo Bison. Buffalo can date its kind of organized baseball history back to 1859. So again, I'm sure baseball was being played, or town ball at least, long before then as well. You just get your first organized club. Professional baseball in Buffalo starts 1877. They are one of the inaugural clubs in the International Association. And just 2 years later, they will be asked, along with the Trojans, to join the National League. And at first, they're not great. But then, 81, they sign Dan Brothers, and they also have a few other stars, Hardy Richardson, Deacon White, drawing a blank on the fourth guy's name, but he was also a big four of the big four. It's the fourth one. Anyway, the Big Four was one of the most exciting offensive shows in baseball in the early 1880s. The Bison are always at the near the top of the National League standings, so they can never really get past the Chicago White Stockings. They're a really outstanding team. They also have people like Bud Galvin, who I already mentioned, Old Hoss Radbourne, or Charles Radbourne, most famous for having the most wins in a single season, pitching 52 wins 1 year with the Province Grays after the other pitcher on their staff quit halfway through the season, so he just had to pitch every game. Radbourne doesn't really do much there. He's also from Rochester, interestingly, so another Canal guy. And for these 4 years, when the Big Four is together in Buffalo, they're great. They're one of the best teams in the league. However, the Bison were also owned by the owner of the Detroit Wolverines, a different National League team. There's a reason why that's not allowed anymore. And in part, what happens here is why. The owner of those two clubs decided he could make more money with one really good team in Detroit and a not good team in Buffalo than two pretty good clubs in both towns. So the Big Four was traded to Detroit, and after that, fans really stopped showing up to Buffalo games, and they are sent back to the International Association, where they would remain for a while. They would briefly return to what are recognized by the major leagues as a major league. The short-lived Players League would host the Buffalo Bison in 1890. So, like I said, the Players League was short-lived, so too was the Bison's tenure in it. However, they would continue to exist in the International Association, that International League, all the way up to today. And you can still see a Buffalo Bison's game just a few blocks from Canal Side in Buffalo. So next time you're checking out either the Seneca Chief, the full-size canal boat model in Buffalo Harbor, or a Bison's game, walk a few blocks, see the other one. Now, I'll look real quick at the player for the Bison. He doesn't play long with the Bison, but he is a guy, the only non-Hall of Famer I'm going to really talk about in this talk. Actually, that's not true anymore. I forgot. Anyway, Joe Hornick. He has a life outside of baseball. It's very centered around the world of the Canal. Hornick was born 1857 in Carthage, New York, the northern terminus of the Black River Canal. From what we can tell, to German immigrants, thousands, if not millions of whom traveled the Erie Canal westward during this time period. His family soon moved to Utica, however, which would be his home for much of his life, and he got his start in the 1870s playing for the Utica Amateur Baseball Club. He was good enough that he drew the attention of minor league scouts, specifically a team in the International Association, the Tecumsehs of London, Ontario. He is signed there. He plays there for 2 years And when the Buffalo Bison get called up to the National League, they also call up Joe Hornick, who's across the Niagara River from them. And he will play with the Buffalo Bison for 2 years. I had the pleasure in 2016, I got to go to the National Baseball Hall of Fame and look at his scrapbook, which is preserved at the Hall of Fame. It was interesting at times, his scrapbook. I was particularly interested in his time with the Bison. Your eyes would kind of glaze over when you went through the scrapbook. He just saved every box score, and there's very little else. There are other things, but most of it's just box scores, him playing. And he did not have eye-popping stats by any means. However, one game with the Bison, he had written, Galvin, good game in the margin. It's like, that's weird. He usually doesn't like have any commentary about these games. But I recognize the name, Galvin, Spud Galvin, future Hall of Famer. And I look at the box score line. Turns out Spud Galvin had just thrown the first no-hitter ever thrown by a left-handed pitcher in Major League history. So Joe Hornick is not a man to overstate things, but yes. So he plays for a little while in the Bisons. However, he gets traded right before they become really good. However, he's traded to one of the better teams in the league, those Boston Red Stockings, where he will spend most of his career. There he became one of the league's premier left fielders. He gets known by the nickname of Ubba Ubba. That is what he would yell to call people off the ball. He was a defensive star at the time. However, unlike baseball players today who make enough money that they don't really have off-season jobs, they often have gated off mansions and stuff. They're not really going into town. Joe Hornick would always return every offseason to his hometown of Utica. The reason I suspect his parents were German immigrants is because he was very heavily involved in the German language organizations of Utica. He's actually the head of the German Turnverein choir at one point. He is their conductor. He is also Utica's one of its earliest electricians. That is what he does in the off season. He learns this new technology and helps to electrify Utica, becoming, like I said, a pretty important member of this Canal Town's community. At the time, it would have been well known. Also well known, I'm sure, in Utica, though not a frequent visitor, was one of Joe Hornick's teammates who also hails from the Canal Corridor. This man, Michael King Kelly, who was born also in 1857, but in the eastern canal city of Troy, to the other large immigrant group that was moving down the canal at this time, the Irish. He was born in an Irish neighborhood to Irish immigrant parents, so they would soon move to New Jersey. And his early career would be spent in that National Association and the International Association before making it with the Chicago White Stockings, where he played a good amount of his career, as well as later with the Boston Red Stockings. Dude loved colored stockings, apparently. And while he is with those two teams, he will become often regarded as kind of the game's first superstar. He is great at baseball. He's hitting well over 300 all the time. He also has this innovative Kelly slide. He really innovates base running in a number of ways. Baseball historians still debate what the Kelly slide would have looked like, but it has another impact on American society as well. Right as he is innovating and wowing audiences with his base running, they also have the new invention of the phonograph that's just coming out. And a song is recorded called Slide Kelly Slide, which is generally regarded as the first and the #1 hit in American history about this man. He also has a very colorful personality. You can kind of see from the dashing mustache. He, unlike Joe Hornick making his money electrifying Utica, makes his money electrifying audiences. He is the rare baseball player who doesn't really have to do kind of more manual physical labor. Instead, he performs on the vaudeville stage. He is sometimes credited with helping make the poem Casey at the Bat the incredibly popular poem it is today, giving his rendition to audiences. My favorite Kelly story, perhaps, is he was also known for being a hard drinker, which is impressive to do for baseball players at that time period. But when he's with the Chicago White Stockings, A.G. Spalding, who we already talked about, and his manager and fellow teammate, Cap Anson, had strict rules about players drinking on game days. And they hired a private investigator to follow King Kelly and confronted him with evidence that they had seen he had been spotted at a saloon at midnight drinking lemonade, to which Kelly said, "That's an absolute lie. It was straight whiskey. I would never be caught dead drinking lemonade at that hour." He's one of the first superstars. He also helps to found that players league that brings baseball back to Buffalo, Major League Baseball back to Buffalo at that time. Sadly, he would die at a relatively young age. Even though he's making money on vaudeville and stuff, a lot of other major league players, they don't make that sort of money. It's not like today where it'd be kind of unthinkable for like the Yankees to stop here in Syracuse and play the Syracuse Mets in a real game. But back in the day, to make extra money, you're playing a lot of the teams that are on your route between cities. In one instance, Kelly's and Cap Anson's White Stockings came here to Syracuse, where they played the next team we're going to talk about in a pretty competitive game, and Syracuse won. It was such an important moment in Syracuse history that in our library, we have history books on the city of Syracuse written 50 years after the fact that still talk about when Cap Anson's White Stockings came to town and the Syracuse Stars beat them. So that brings me to the Syracuse Stars. Let's talk about them. The first organized baseball club was founded in Syracuse in 1858. The Syracuse Stars are founded in 1875, and they're Syracuse's kind of big league club, if you will. In fact, they will soon become the big league club. But let's talk about how they get there. At one point, they will sign a man, he's a bricklayer from Syracuse by the name of Henry McCormick, who's a pitcher. He's an all-right pitcher. They go play a tournament up in Watertown, and the Stars get absolutely demolished by a young pitcher, a guy who had actually pitched early in his life up in Fulton. He had gone to seminary there. A man by the name of Candy Cummings. Cummings had created a new type of pitch, one that curved. He's generally credited with inventing the curveball. I gave this talk in Fulton once, and they were like, "Did you know that Fulton's the home of the curveball?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And they mentioned that Cummings had gone to seminary there and had played on their baseball team. So likely he probably tested out the curveball. And you can still see actually the field where that happened if you're up in Fulton anytime. Anyway, McCormick is interested by this pitch Cummings can throw, learns how to throw the curve, and soon becomes one of the best players in baseball. And behind him, the Stars became good enough that in 1879, Syracuse would be asked to join the National League. Sadly, McCormick passed away of a mysterious illness. He died young for some reason. And they did not last long in the National League and quickly get sent back to the International Association or International League. However, they would be one of the best teams there for quite a while, including winning the 1888 title. Here we have a picture actually from 1888, and it's a really interesting team that is assembled here with the Stars. They're really buoyed by their pitching. including two interesting characters, Ed Dundon, who was deaf and mute. This was actually an era when deaf players were pretty prominent in the league. A lot of schools for the deaf wanted to show that their students were just as good as anyone else. So the schools of the deaf baseball teams were some of the best in the country. Sometimes those schools and pitchers like Ed Dundon are credited with inventing things like signs for pitches and stealing, though that is debated among baseball historians. Another one of their pitchers is Bob Higgins, who has a pretty good couple of years with the Stars. He is also an African American as well, so this is an integrated baseball team. And I just learned about this literally yesterday. Their other major pitcher on the team was a man by the name of Cornelius Murphy, who would later, several years later, actually found a ginger beer company in Oswego, New York, right on the banks of the Erie Canal, with our archivist's great-great-grandfather. So that was interesting. So yeah, they're led by pitching and another person we're going to talk about in a second. But first, a little more about the Stars. They will briefly join one of these other upstart major leagues in 1890, the American Association. But that's pretty short-lived as well. And they head on back down and will be Syracuse's minor league club for a while. They're kind of the progenitors of today's Syracuse Mets. The other person on this team I want to highlight, though, before I forget, most of their games were played at a stadium called Star Park, which is on the south side. But for several years, they also played at a different park called Lakeside Park, which was next to Onondaga Lake. And fans of the Syracuse Stars could actually take a canal boat to the game. A man by the name of Frank Wiley ran a small steamboat between Clinton Square and the ballpark for games. Interesting fact. But the player I want to highlight right now is this man who played for 2 years for the Syracuse Stars. That is Moses Fleetwood Walker. Fleetwood Walker, I know at least one member of the audience knows who that is, was born 1856 in Ohio. He was educated and played at for the baseball teams of Oberlin College and the University of Michigan, being a standout player, along with his brother, with both. 1883, he would be signed by the Toledo Blue Stockings as a catcher. And the next year, the Blue Stockings were invited to join the American Association, one of these major leagues. As a result, Moses Fleetwood Walker would continue playing with this team. Moses Fleetwood Walker is an African American and is generally considered the first Black player in Major League history. It's not Jackie Robinson. I'll talk a little about that in a bit. Walker would play for the Blue Stockings for a while before running into that White Stockings team that we mentioned before. And that guy who had hired the private investigator to go after King Kelly, Cap Anson, also has a problem with Moses Fleetwood Walker, primarily the fact that he is Black and Anson is a virulent racist. He refused to take the field against a Black player and let it be known that he would not play against any team that had a Black player on it. As a result, Major League Baseball teams, white Major League Baseball teams, owners would enter what is called the Gentleman's Agreement, which would say that no Black players would be allowed to sign with big league clubs. So thus would be born eventually the Negro Leagues. Another guy who I'm hoping to incorporate at some point into this talk, though it's running along. Bud Fowler is often considered one of the early founders. He is from Frankfort, New York, grows up in Cooperstown. He's now buried in Fort Plain. We might have Fort Plain and Frankfort mixed up. They're both down in the Mohawk Valley He's buried in one of those places and was just recently inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And he would go create some of the early successful barnstorming black teams around the country. But anyway, back to Fleetwood Walker. As a result of the gentleman's agreement, he gets blackballed from the major leagues. However, many of the minor leagues do not have this gentleman's agreement in place yet, including the International Association. So he signs with the Stars in 1888, as a catcher, helping lend his veteran presence to that club that's going to win the International League title. He and Bob Higgins will form one of the first all-black batteries of pitchers and catchers in baseball history between the two of them. However, he will be released in 1889. However, he still stays here in Syracuse for a number of years. He gets a job at the post office. He also works with a Syracuse professor to obtain a patent. However, as he is walking just a few blocks south of here, some accounts say possibly to meet with his manager from the Stars to talk about a comeback to the game, he would be accosted from a tavern by several Irish immigrants, attacking with racial epithets, etc., and eventually just attacking him physically. He would stab one of these men to death with his letter carrier's knife, and a murder trial would ensue. This was a huge story in the press. It brought up a lot. Most Fleetwood Walker is a fairly well-known guy nationally. This is a major story about race relations in general. He pleads self-defense. Other people aren't willing to give a black man that sort of leniency generally, but ultimately he would be acquitted of second-degree murder. However, he moved back to Ohio after this, working with his brother to found a prominent black nationalist press following the teachings of Marcus Garvey, Back to Africa movement, until his death in, I believe, the 1820s. So yeah, that's Moses Fleetwood Walker, an interesting character who lived right here in Syracuse along the banks of the Erie Canal. So our final character in this story is the man pictured here, John McGraw, born actually outside the canal corridor. It's still nearby in Truxton, New York. He's a generation younger than most of the guys we've been talking about. He's born 1873. And he starts his career out with his local Truxton Braves. He, however, impresses a guy on a train because he can throw this newfangled curveball pitch. This is back in the era when you could impress a guy on a train and they'd sign you to a minor league baseball contract. And he ends up playing down in Olean at the southern terminus of the Genesee Valley Canal and also in Wellsville before gaining the attention of major league scouts, who become particularly notable with the Baltimore Orioles, starring as their third baseman. He helps them innovate a number of new tactics along with his other star players, like Wee Willie Keeler, guy who famously coined the phrase, hit it where they aimed, right? Well, that's in part because McGraw and him are working out the basics of the hit and run. They also are creating what's known as the Baltimore Chop. They had a great relationship with their grounds crew, seemingly, who would pack the dirt right in front of the plate so they could chop the ball right in the dirt. The ball would bounce really high, and they could get to first base before it would ever come back down. They also would notably keep the grass high in the outfield so they could conveniently hide baseballs in the grass, turn easy doubles into singles, that sort of thing. McGraw was known for being a feisty player and also kind of a bit of a cheater at times. Famously, he would, at third base, grab players' belts and hold them there if they were tagging up. One opposing player supposedly knew that was going to happen, so he unbuckled his belt. McGraw was left standing with a belt in his hand and was ejected. But yeah, the Orioles, with this kind of hard-fighting attitude, but also innovative baseball tactics, become really the best team in the 1890s. They also bring in some important veteran talent, including an old but still great first baseman, Big Dan Brothers, will sign with them, becomes good friends with the much younger John McGraw, and eventually McGraw will retire as a player, but will go on to really ultimately the southern terminus of the canal, New York City, where he becomes a manager with the New York Giants, becoming the winningest manager in National League history. While he is managing the New York Giants, he actually will hire for the Polo Grounds his old friend from the Baltimore Orioles, who has just retired at the age of 46 from the Hudson River League. Dan Brothers brings him on to be their groundskeeper and gatekeeper as well. But McGraw is going to bring that innovation he brought with the Orioles as a player. He's going to implement that as a manager and will forever really change the game of baseball. A lot of other changes happen around this time as well. In 1901, the American League is founded. This new upstart league, this one's actually going to stick, unlike several of the other ones we've talked about. 1903, finally, McGraw's Giants. McGraw hates the American League. They lose the National League pennant, so the winner of the National League finally agrees to play the American League. The Boston Americans, who will eventually become the Boston Red Sox, will defeat the Pittsburgh Pirates in the first ever World Series. And yeah, the game is changing. It's much faster paced now, very different than the game that everyone we've been looking at so far played for the most part. And one person who's kind of caught up in this is Ed Delahanty, who is a star player primarily with the Philadelphia Phillies. He's very similar to Dan Brothers. Their careers are parallel in a lot of ways. However, by the early 1900s, Ed Delahanty is on his way down. He's not as good. He can't keep up with this newer, fast-paced game anymore. He gets traded while on a road trip in Detroit to the Washington Senators, which he did not want to go to. He'd lived pretty much his whole life in Philadelphia, or at least his adult life there. And on the train from Detroit, even though he got traded, the trains only go one way, really. So he's still hanging around with his teammates, pretty upset. He ends up drinking heavily and is kicked off the train on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. He is last seen passing over the International Bridge over the Niagara River above the falls. He's last seen alive, I should say. He is found the next day, July 2nd, 1903, at the bottom of the falls, sadly having died. And that's how I used to end this talk, with this sad, symbolic ending to this era. Here we are at the end of the Canal Corridor, essentially, and the end of the era when the Canal Corridor is kind of at its height for producing baseball talent and having Major League Baseball within it. Obviously, more great baseball players would come out of the Canal Corridor, very notably Warren Spahn, 300-game pitcher for the Braves in the 50s primarily, is from Buffalo, was from Buffalo, I guess. But then in 2020, you may have heard about it, there was a pandemic, right? And it became increasingly difficult to travel across borders. There were a lot of travel restrictions going on. And Major League Baseball decided to play a shortened season in the second half of 2020. And one of the teams, the Toronto Blue Jays, figured it was going to be easier to just play in America than have to go through the hassle of passing between the borders and having opposing teams. So for 1 year, Major League Baseball briefly came back to the Canal Corridor with the Toronto Blue Jays playing their home games at Salins Field in the shortened 2020 season. Sadly, they did not rebrand to the Buffalo Blue Jays, but there were a ton of Buffalo Blue Jays t-shirts going around at the time, I remember. And now here we are. Today, we still got a lot of minor league clubs around. Mets are playing right now. It's Polish night. That's baseball in the Canal Corridor. Any questions? Yes. Oh, sorry.
I saw the Red Sox beat company with the Blue Jays there. It was a great game where they blew out the Blue Jays in Buffalo.
There you go. Yeah.
They had 8 runs in the first inning.
Wow.
One of our highlight games, and it was the closest I've ever been to the field.
Oh.
I could afford a ticket.
Ballpark.
That's right.
Yeah.
But one, it's not really on the corridor per se, but in the history of the game, of course, all the attribution to Cooperstown and to Doubleday. You skipped over anything with that.
Yes.
Anything about that?
Cooperstown and Abner Doubleday. I skip over it in part because Doubleday's involvement with the game is largely considered at this point to be a myth. Pretty much made up. A lot of different things have come together to show pretty definitively that he did not, the story that was presented didn't happen. That said, I mean, I'm glad they made up the myth because now we have the Baseball Hall of Fame right down the road. And you have great teams like the Auburn Doubledays that existed in the area.
One of the famous players that I think is from Troy, and I can never remember which one it is, but either Tinker or Evers Chance, one of them is from Troy.
You are correct. I can't remember which one.
I can't remember.
I remember I looked at his file.
And he's buried in Rensselaer or someplace. Tinker. It's Tinker?
Tinker, okay, there we go. Yes.
Moses Fleetwood Walker got to Syracuse because he followed the Toledo Blue Stocking manager. He became a favorite. And when that manager, whose name I don't recall, when he went to Syracuse, that Fleetwood Walker followed him there. And also Fleetwood and his brother Weldy, they had vaudeville films, and they're really, really interesting people. Their father was a doctor, probably the first African-American doctor in the upper Ohio region where they were from.
Yeah, Walker's a fascinating guy in his own right. It's very good. I think it was last year or the year before, the Mets had Fleetwood Walker bobblehead night, dude.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, I want to get my hands on one of those.
He was, from what my research showed, that he was beloved in Syracuse. And, he was really highly regarded for what he brought here.
One of the title.
May have been one of the first places where they had a vaudeville hall or something, he and his brother.
Okay, I don't fully know, but.
And my question, where did you go to school, young man?
Well, I went to Chittenango High School.
Well,
fellow Bear. But I also went to SUNY Portland and Syracuse University.
Very good.
Maureen, do you have a question? Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, wow, I've got, this is more questions in the chat than usual. There we go. Jack Rowe was the guy I think I missed. Delaware Hudson Railroad had a baseball team. It's good to know. And we've got a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm not sure this is the accurate to say, but would Cap Hansen be first kind of originator of keeping players of color out of baseball?
Camp Ensign is one of the bigger villains. Sure. Yeah.
I just gave a talk on African Americans baseball at the Abolition Hall of Fame in Peterborough. Familiar? Okay.
Check out the Abolition Hall of Fame.
Later. And no one person is actually the guy, but he has shown much because, as Garrett said, he was a really bad racist. And so the story goes, it was an exhibition game in August of 1883, and Anson's White Stockings were playing the Blue Stockings from Toledo. And his comment was, if there's one of those, we're not playing. And of course, it was an exhibition game. So how they made their money was they split the gate.
Yeah.
So the promoter said, Well, you're not gonna play, then there's no game.
Right.
So,
And
yeah, this is what we'll play today.
yes.
And the other irony of that is that, Moses Walker was injured. But his manager, when he heard the comment, he put him in the game.
Nice, yeah.
So, you know, again, how much of that is, you
Yeah.
know, they're going, but that's a great question. No one person,
Yeah.
but he really bears the biggest burden of it because he then went to the owners.
Yeah, I mean, Anson was pretty much the biggest, if not one of, if not the biggest star in the game,
Yeah.
and him not being willing to play.
Guy to get 3,000 hits.
Yeah, he's yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure there were. Yeah.
So it's kind of spinning off of that whole thing. It might like to be on the area you're really covering here. Were there many of the either Negro leagues or barnstorming Negro teams playing in this area? Any era?
I would need to do more research on that. Like I said, Bud Fowler is from here, who kind of is one of the early progenitors of kind of the Negro Leagues and Black Barnstorming. But I would need to look into that more to say definitively. I would be shocked if Buffalo at least didn't have it. It's a big enough city. Can't imagine it didn't.
That's all really interesting stuff.
Yes,
The Bartholomew Poppins.
it's just a hard stuff to also track.
Yeah, oh, yes.
Did you ever see that, great movie about the bingo log and the traveling all
Oh,
stars?
absolutely.
Yeah, That's, I don't know how accurate it is, but it's like fun.
No, there's sprinkles of truth, I'm sure.
I'm sure. This, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Syracuse Poster Project. Of course, we got one from the Erie Canal. But last year, they had local figures that we all wanted to wrote haiku for, Main Street Plan. But, but this was the one chosen for Moses Fleetwood Walker. So you can get this poster, Syracuse Poster Project, and they have them all displayed downtown, all around the city. You'll see the kiosks. Now, I can't tell you
I was about to
exactly
say,
where his is.
I know that if you stop by the post office on Sloan Street,
That's right.
that poster is up there.
That's right.
Oh,
The post office says it all on the window, but this was, he made history. And it's the haiku 575 formula for the syllables. He made history. He knocked it out of the park with enlightened cheers.
Oh, that's fabulous. So, thank you so much. That's great.
Well, any other questions?
Garrett, this was terrific.
What?
Anybody had a mustache?
Yes.
Probably not.
I have no idea why everyone needed a mustache, but that was just what you had. When you played
There's a
baseball.
funny piece of baseball card trivia in the most sought after baseball card set are the T206, 1909 to 1911. T stands for tobacco.
Oh, sure.
Okay, and that designation, by the way, was that baseball card designation was created by Jefferson Burdick, who is a Syracuse native.
Oh,
All
Burdick Street.
all that
yeah.
all that delineation is there.
Huh.
Anyways, there are 524 cards, actually 528, but I won't be details in that set. Only one player in that set has a mustache. It's a highly sought after collectible.
Weird
And I
stuff.
can't remember his name now because I'm old, but
Sure. Well, thanks again, everyone, for coming out, and thanks everyone on Zoom.